It was an ordinary Tuesday. Joel Vance signed the transfer document on the hood of his car in the rain, $20 in cash, folded once in his jacket pocket, because that was what the agreement said and that was what he needed it to say. He handed the document through the window of Conrad Sloane's car. Conrad Sloane drove away. The patent was gone. 16 months later, the licensing deal that Sloane closed on that same patent was reported in the Wall Street Journal at $400 million even, and Joel read about it on a laptop in the back of the pharmacy he was about to lose at 11:47 p.m. on a Friday, with the number $187,000 still open in another tab. He did not call anyone. He closed both tabs. He went to check on his daughter. The pharmacy sat on the corner of Elm and Calhoun in a building that had been a pharmacy since 1961 and had belonged to Joel's father before it belonged to Joel, and its shelves were in better order than its finances and had been for 2 years. Joel ran compounding, custom-formulated medications for patients whose needs fell outside what mass production could accommodate. And the work was precise in the way that all meaningful work is precise, which is to say it required you to be exactly right or exactly wrong with very little room between. He had a degree in biochemical engineering from Northwestern that he did not have framed anywhere in the pharmacy because it had not seemed relevant when he came back to take over the shop, and now it seemed like a different person's credential entirely. On the counter beside the compounding bench, 3 active prescriptions waiting on ingredient delivery. A pediatric anticonvulsant for a 6-year-old in the county who could not tolerate the commercial formulation. A transdermal pain compound for a veteran at the VA who had stopped responding to oral delivery. A topical antifungal for an immunocompromised patient at the hospital who needed a concentration no manufacturer currently produced. Joel looked at these 3 cards the way other men looked at nothing in particular. They reminded him what the work was for. His daughter Mara was 7 years old and was doing homework at the corner table that had been his homework table when he was 7, in the same chair, under the same light. She had her mother's hair and her mother's habit of chewing on the end of a pencil when she was near the end of a problem. And these were the 2 things that still stopped him sometimes, mid-task, for reasons he did not try to explain to himself anymore, because some things did not get smaller with explanation. In her coat pocket, the left one always, was a small glass vial stoppered with dark wax. Her mother had left it. Mara had been 4 when her mother left it, and she had carried it every day since. And when Joel had asked her once what it smelled like, she had said, "The day before, something good happens." The ticking clock was $187,000. It was the accumulated interest and principal on a commercial loan the pharmacy had taken on in 2020 to survive a supply chain disruption that had lasted 8 months longer than the bank's model had anticipated. The bank's model had not anticipated much of what had happened to small compounders in those years. The number of days remaining before the bank's final motion was 23. He had sold the patent because of the loan. He had sold it for $20 because the agreement specified a nominal transfer fee, and he had not had a lawyer present, and he had been in the 3rd month of the loan crisis, and he had believed, because Conrad Sloane had told him, and because he had been too exhausted to disbelieve, that the patent was effectively worthless. A drug delivery mechanism that had passed Phase 1 trials and stalled in Phase 2 and would require another $4 million in development capital to go anywhere. Joel did not have $4 million. He had not had $4 million since the day he came back to the pharmacy. He had signed the document on the hood of his car in the rain and tried not to think about what the mechanism had cost him to develop, which was 11 years of his life and 1 marriage, and the version of himself that had believed persistence was enough. He had not stopped believing that persistence was enough. He had simply redefined the field in which it applied. Across the city, in the 17th floor conference room of Parrish Ventures, Diana Parrish was ending a presentation she had started that morning and had refined through 3 intermediate versions because the final version needed to be capable of withstanding questions from people who would try to find the seams. There were no seams. The Solaris Compound licensing round, $1.1 billion in structured venture financing, built around a drug delivery mechanism that had passed all 4 phases of clinical trial and was 18 months from commercial approval, had been assembled over 14 months, and Diana had touched every piece of it. The mechanism in question allowed a class of oncology drugs to cross the blood-brain barrier with a precision that the previous generation of delivery systems could not match. The licensing income projections over 10 years were, depending on the model, between $2.8 and $4.1 billion. The room believed it because Diana presented things that were true, and the things that were true were the only things she presented. What Diana's money could not fix was this. She had a sister who had been in a clinical trial for a glioblastoma drug 3 years ago, a trial that had stalled because the delivery mechanism used in the drug's formulation had not been able to cross the blood-brain barrier reliably enough to produce consistent results. The trial had ended. Her sister had not. She lived now in a town 2 hours north, in a house with a garden she could still tend on good days, and a phone she called Diana on most evenings, and Diana answered every call on the first ring from whatever room she was in, whatever meeting she was adjacent to, whatever number she did not recognize, because she had learned the year of the trial that the cost of missing a call was something she was not willing to calculate again. She had invested in Solaris because the mechanism worked. She had invested in Solaris because the mechanism was the thing that should have existed 3 years ago, and hadn't. She had done the due diligence. She had read every filing. She had not known, had had no reason to know, that the mechanism had a prior inventor, that the patent had changed hands in a parking lot in the rain for a nominal fee, that the name on the original filing was not Sloan Biotech, LLC, but a man named Joel Vance, biochemical engineer, working alone in a lab that no longer existed. She would find this out on a Wednesday. But first it was Tuesday evening, and she had a presentation to finalize, and her sister had called twice already, and the second call was still on her screen, and she was going to answer it in 17 minutes when the last slide was locked, and not before. And she had been telling herself that for 6 months about various 17-minute windows. And each time the window closed, the weight of it was slightly heavier than the time before. She had agreed to the Thursday pharmacy visit because her firm's portfolio manager had flagged Vance Compounding as a potential acquisition target. A small but highly skilled compounding operation with an unusually strong record on pediatric and oncology-adjacent formulations. Diana did not typically visit acquisition targets this early in the process. She was going because she needed to be in a room where something was being built carefully, by hand, for a specific person who needed it. She did not say this to the portfolio manager. She said she wanted to see the operation firsthand. She had never been inside a compounding pharmacy. She did not know what to expect. Neither did he. She arrived 14 minutes early because she arrived 14 minutes early to everything. And she stood in the front of the pharmacy reading the labels on the counter displays with the focused attention of someone who reads everything, always, before speaking. Joel came out from the compounding area and she turned and he was wearing a lab coat over a flannel shirt, and she categorized him in the way she categorized everything. The coat was clean, which meant the work was precise. His hands, when he offered one to shake, were dry and faintly chemical-smelling in a way that was not unpleasant, but was specific, not the general pharmacy smell of the front counter, but something more controlled, more particular, more like the smell of a working laboratory than a retail space. She said, "Diana Parrish, thank you for the time." He said, "Joel Vance, come on back." She followed him into the compounding area, and he began explaining the operation with the efficiency of someone who had explained it many times and had edited the explanation down to what actually mattered. She listened. She looked at the equipment. She looked at the labeled vials on the staging shelf, the temperature logs on the wall, the precision scale zeroed and ready at the bench. She looked at the case files on the side table, 3 of them, each with a patient code and a formulation spec. She stopped at the 3rd one. She looked at the formulation spec on the top page. She looked at the molecular geometry notation in the margin, handwritten, not printed, a shorthand notation that was not standard compounding notation. It was the notation used in advanced pharmaceutical research. Specifically, it was the notation used in the branch of research that dealt with membrane-crossing delivery mechanisms. She said, "This notation," and then she stopped, because she had not meant to say it aloud, and because she was looking at it again, and the recognition was specific and anomalous, and she did not yet have a framework for what it meant. Joel did not look at the case file. He looked at her. He said, "It's faster for me. Old habit." She said, "Where did you—" She stopped again. The question escaped before she decided to ask it. She did not finish it. He said, "The formulation spec is proprietary to the patient's case. I'll need to close that file." She stepped back. He closed the file. She had the notation in her memory now, the specific shorthand, the specific way the geometry had been bracketed, and her memory did not release things it had decided to hold. She wanted to ask the question she had not finished. He had given her no reason to stay on the subject. He moved to the scale and picked up a clean spatula and returned to what he had been doing. And she stood in the compounding area of a pharmacy she had arrived 14 minutes early to assess for acquisition, and felt the floor of her framework shift slightly, almost imperceptibly, in the way floors shift when something beneath them has moved. She did not know what had moved. She knew something had. They were in the front of the pharmacy 20 minutes later, Joel explaining the patient demographic, and Diana asking the questions that portfolio due diligence required. When the back door opened, and Mara came in from the after-school program 2 doors down, carrying a backpack that was almost as wide as she was, and a drawing she had made that she wanted to show her father before she sat down. She put the drawing on the counter between them without looking at Diana. The drawing was of a molecule. It was not an accurate molecule, the bonds were approximate, and the geometry was a child's interpretation. But it was recognizably a molecule, with a center node and radiating connections and labels in crayon that said things like "good part," and "this goes here." Joel said, "Mara." Mara looked at Diana for the first time. She assessed Diana with the thoroughness of someone who has not yet learned to perform the assessment less visibly. Then she said, "Are you sick?" Diana said, "I'm sorry?" "Most people who come here are sick," Mara said. "Or they have someone who's sick." She looked at Diana without any particular pressure in the look. "You don't look sick, but sometimes you can't tell." Diana opened her mouth. The response she had assembled, something neat, something adult, something that handled the question from the appropriate professional distance, was not the response that came. What came was, "Someone I love was sick. She's better now." Mara considered this. She pulled out the stool at the end of the counter and climbed onto it, and set her backpack down. She reached into her left coat pocket and took out the small glass vial and held it in her palm for a moment, not opening it. My mom left me this, she said. It smells like the day before something good happens. She looked at Diana with a frankness that was not unkind. Maybe that's why you came. Diana looked at the vial in the child's hand. She had been in 17 boardrooms in the past month. She had closed a $1.1 billion financing round. She had read every filing, every risk disclosure, every footnote in every supplemental, and she had not been caught off guard by any of it. She was caught off guard by a 7-year-old's vial of perfume and the specific and unreasonable accuracy of the sentence that came with it. And the being caught off guard manifested as a half-second in which she forgot what she was about to say next and simply looked at the vial and the child and said nothing. Mara seemed satisfied with this. She put the vial back in her pocket. She opened her backpack and took out her homework. Joel was watching from behind the counter. He was not managing the exchange. He was not prompting Mara or providing Diana social cover. He was watching, and his expression was not pride exactly, though pride was in it somewhere. It was more like the expression of a man who has learned to trust a particular compass reading even when he cannot see the terrain ahead. Diana stood in the pharmacy with the weight of what the child had said still in her chest, off balance in a way she could not account for, tilted in a direction she had not chosen, and she did not try to correct the tilt, because she had lived too long believing that correction was always better than feeling. Conrad Sloan arrived at the pharmacy on Friday morning. He did not knock. He straightened the cap on his pen, removed it, replaced it, before he came through the door. He was wearing a suit that announced itself before the man did, and he had the particular quality of people who have been correct about enough things that they have stopped checking whether they are still correct. And his entrance had the momentum of someone arriving at a meeting that is already running behind. Joel. He used only the first name. He looked at Diana, who was there for a second visit she had not announced. He looked at her the way he looked at things that had not been in his calculation. Ms. Parrish. He knew who she was. Of course he knew. I didn't realize you were consulting with outside investors. She's not consulting, Joel said. She's a customer. Conrad's mouth moved in a way that was almost a smile. He removed the cap from his pen and replaced it. I came to discuss the terms of the 2022 transfer. There are some questions about the original filing timeline that my legal team wants to. The filing timeline is public record, Joel said. He was standing at the compounding bench, a spatula in one hand. USPTO application 16/847203. Filed March 2019, transferred November 2022. He set the spatula down. The transfer agreement is also in the record. Nominal fee of $20. My signature. Your notary. He picked up the spatula again. Is there a specific page your legal team has a question about? Conrad removed the cap from his pen. He did not replace it immediately. He looked at Diana. He looked at Joel. He said, "You should understand that the licensing arrangement with Solaris represents a significant. The Cayman entity that received the initial licensing fee from Sloan Biotech was registered 4 months before the transfer," Joel said. He had not raised his voice. He was doing something with the spatula and the scale. That entity received $6.3 million from the pre-licensing option agreement with Harcourt Pharmaceutical in January 2023. The option agreement was signed 8 days after the transfer was completed, the transfer that closed in November 2022. He looked at Conrad once. The SEC's beneficial ownership disclosure requirements would cover an option agreement of that size. I'd imagine your filing is in order. It was not a question. Conrad stood in the front of the pharmacy with the pen cap between his fingers and did not replace it. He had removed it before speaking every time Diana had seen him do it, in 3 meetings over 14 months, and he was not replacing it now. The pen was just a pen. His hands were just hands. The particular arrogance that had preceded him through the door was losing pressure the way a room loses warmth when the heat is cut. Not suddenly, just inevitably, 1 degree at a time. He said, "You'll want to be careful about the implications of," Joel said. "The USPTO also maintains a record of the original inventor's name on file transfers. That name stays on the record regardless of the transfer. I'd recommend your legal team look at page 3 of the Solaris licensing prospectus." He returned to the scale. "I'd close the door on your way out." Conrad Sloan left. He did not look at Diana. He did not make a parting remark. He walked out of the pharmacy and the door closed behind him, and what was left in the room where he had been was simply the absence of him. No threat, no echo, no residue of anything that had mattered. He had entered with momentum and exited with none, and the distance between those 2 states was the most frightening thing Diana had seen in a room in a long time. She stood in the front of the pharmacy for 1 full paragraph of silence that she did not try to fill. She looked at the door. She looked at the counter. She looked at Joel, who was measuring something on the scale with his eyes down, as though nothing that had happened in the last 4 minutes had altered the trajectory of the afternoon by a single degree, as though he had said what the facts required him to say, and had now returned to the work that the facts did not touch. Her hands were very still. She found it herself because she always found things herself, and because she needed it to be her own discovery and not something given to her. She called her legal team at 4:30 that Friday afternoon and asked for a full chain of title search on USPTO application 16/847203. She had the result by 6. Original inventor, Joel Evan Vance, Biochemical Engineering Ph.D., Northwestern 2009. The mechanism had been developed through a research program at Crestfield University's Applied Pharmacology Lab between 2014 and 2019 in a lab that had since been decommissioned and the space reassigned. She sat with that for an hour. Then she called her portfolio manager and asked for the Solaris licensing prospectus. Page 3. The mechanism description. The footnote in the mechanism description that referenced the prior art filing. The prior art filing number. She cross-referenced the number. It matched. Her firm had funded a $1.1 billion licensing round on a mechanism that had been transferred away from its inventor for $20. She had read every filing. She had not read the original USPTO application because the original application was not in the due diligence package Sloan Biotech had provided, and she had not independently searched it because she had had no reason to, and she had had no reason to because she had not known there was a reason, and she had not known because no one had told her. No one had told her. She thought about the notation in the margin of the case file, the shorthand she had recognized, the question she had not finished asking, and the answer he had not given, and the 17 months between the transfer and the licensing deal, and the 7-year-old with the perfume vial and the sentence about the day before something good happens. She called Joel at 7:15. He answered on the second ring. She said, "Take me to the lab." A silence. Not surprise exactly. Something older than surprise. He said, "It's not a lab anymore." She said, "I know. Take me anyway." The building at the edge of the Crestfield campus was a concrete and glass structure that had been renovated twice and then decommissioned in 2021, and was awaiting a decision about its future that the university had not yet made. Joel had a key because the facilities manager had gone to high school with his father and had not asked for it back. He unlocked the side entrance and held the door, and they walked down a hallway that smelled of old ventilation and nothing else until they reached the room at the end. The room had been a research lab. The benches were still there, stripped of their equipment. The fluorescent overheads still worked. Joel stood at the bench he had used for 6 years, and he put his hands flat on the surface and he talked. He talked in the same register he used for everything else. No drama in his voice, no performance in his posture. He stated the facts, and the facts were these. He had developed the mechanism over 5 years using his own research hours and a university equipment sharing arrangement that had no formal IP agreement attached. He had filed the patent independently in 2019. He had continued developing the mechanism through 2021 while simultaneously returning to the pharmacy after his father's stroke. He had run out of development capital in the summer of 2022 when the pharmacy loan had hit its crisis point, and he had been approached by Sloan Biotech through an intermediary who had framed the mechanism as commercially non-viable and had offered to take the liability of continued development off his hands. He had been told the mechanism had stalled in Phase 2. He had been told this by someone he had believed. He had signed the document on the hood of his car in the rain. He did not say, "I should have known." He did not say, "I trusted the wrong person." He said the facts, and the facts were what they were, and the devastation was in the facts, and not in how he held them. Then he said, "The mechanism didn't stall in Phase 2. It cleared Phase 2 in January 2023. The Phase 2 report had been completed by Crestfield's trial team in August 2022, 3 months before the transfer." He looked at the bench surface. The intermediary who approached me was employed by Sloan Biotech at the time. He had access to the Phase 2 data. Diana stood in the decommissioned lab and understood that the mechanism that had saved, might have saved, should have saved. The version of her sister's trial that had not happened was sitting in a pharmacy 19 blocks away in the hands of its inventor, who had been told it was dead and had sold it in the rain for the price of a meal, and that her firm, her due diligence, her 14 months of careful reading had funded the man who had done this. She had not known. She had had no way to know. The knowing was not the point. The point was that she was standing in a room with a man who had known for 16 months exactly who had invested in the round that made Conrad Sloan's position worth $400 million, and he had not said it. He had not called her firm. He had not leaked to the press. He had not done any of the things that most people in his position would have done. She said, "You knew who I was when I came to the pharmacy?" He said, "I did." She said, "You knew about the Solaris round?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Why didn't you?" He said, "Because it wasn't your fault." He looked at her. "And because Mara likes you." Diana Parrish stood in a stripped laboratory that smelled of old ventilation and understood that she had been looking at this man in the wrong direction from the first moment she had read his name on a due diligence file. And the understanding arrived not as guilt, but as the thing that precedes guilt. The full assembly of a picture you have been looking at in pieces, and the pieces arranging themselves, and the completed image being heavier and more specific than any of the pieces had suggested it would be. The evidence Joel had described to Conrad in the pharmacy was real, and was in the form he had said it was in. And the question was not whether it reached the right authority, but when. Diana made the determination about when on Saturday morning, after spending Friday night reading the original USPTO application from 2014 to 2019, all of it, every page, every figure, every claim, and understanding, for the first time, the full scope of what had been in that lab when it was still a lab. She called the SEC's Enforcement Division at 9 on Monday morning. She submitted the beneficial ownership disclosure analysis alongside a formal request for examination of the pre-licensing option agreement and the Phase 2 suppression timeline. She did this as the lead investor in the Solaris round, which gave her standing, and she did it because it was the right thing to do, and she had a habit of doing right things when she was certain they were right. And she was certain. She also called her firm's legal team and initiated a review of the Solaris licensing prospectus for material omissions. The review took 11 days. The omissions were material. The prospectus had not disclosed the transfer history or the prior inventor's identity or the existence of the pre-licensing option agreement. Under securities law, this was not a gray area. Conrad Sloan was in a conference room at his legal team's office on a Wednesday when two agents from the SEC's New York regional office arrived at 2 in the afternoon and requested the full documentary record for the Sloan Biotech patent transfer of November 2022 and the Harcourt option agreement of January 2023 and the beneficial ownership structure of the Cayman entity that had received the option proceeds. He was seated at the head of the table. His legal team was seated to his right. The room had a long window that looked out onto 6th Avenue, and the afternoon was clear. He looked at the documents they placed in front of him. He looked at the agents. He looked at the window. He reached for his pen. He removed the cap. He did not replace it. His attorney said, "My client will need time to review." The agent said, "Of course. We'll need the documents by Friday." He placed a second document on the table, a court order signed that morning, freezing the Cayman entity's assets pending the investigation. Conrad Sloan set his pen down with the cap still off. His hands went to the table and stayed there. The pen cap was on the table beside the pen. In the place where his certainty had been when he walked into the room 40 minutes ago, there was simply the view of 6th Avenue and the clear afternoon and the understanding, arriving in his hands first and then moving upward, that he had no exit from this room that looked like anything other than what it was. He said, "This is a mischaracterization of the..." The agent said, "Friday, Mr. Sloan." He closed his folder. Conrad's last line died before it finished. He did not stand. He did not compose himself for departure. He simply sat in the chair with the uncapped pen in front of him and the frozen account order to his left and the window to his right, showing 6th Avenue going about its afternoon as though nothing in that room had any weight at all. He was removed from the Solaris licensing agreement within 30 days by a unanimous vote of the board, following the SEC's formal investigation initiation and the civil complaint filed by Diana's firm on behalf of the investor pool. The USPTO initiated a review of the transfer on the grounds of material misrepresentation in the transfer instrument. The review concluded 14 months later with the transfer voided. The patent reverted to its original inventor. The bank received a certified payment of $100,000 on the 21st day, 2 days before the final motion deadline. The source of the funds was a bridge loan arranged by Parrish Ventures in advance of the patent reversion, structured against the projected licensing income of a mechanism that now had a known and valid inventor and a clear path to the commercial approval it had always been moving toward. The bank's motion was withdrawn. The pharmacy stayed open. Joel received the notification on a Thursday morning, and he read it at the compounding bench, and then he put it down on the bench and stood with his hands flat on the surface and said nothing for some time. Then he picked up where he had left off. There was a formulation waiting. The patient was a child in the county who could not tolerate the commercial option. The work was the same work it had always been, and it was enough, and it had always been enough, and now there was more of it ahead. 1 year later. Mara was 8 and had started a new phase she called the molecule phase, which involved drawing molecular structures on whatever surface was available and explaining them to anyone who would listen. She had a teacher who encouraged this. She had a father who had begun, slowly, to frame some of his older Northwestern coursework on the wall behind the compounding bench, not as a trophy, more as a reminder that the work had a history, and the history had not ended. She still carried the vial. She said it still smelled right. The pharmacy had a second compounding bench now, and a new pediatric specialist on contract 2 days a week, and a research affiliation with Crestfield's applied pharmacology program that was producing the kind of work that does not make news but makes an enormous difference to specific people in specific rooms who are waiting for something no one else makes. Joel had been asked to teach a seminar there in the fall. He had said he would think about it. He was thinking about it. Diana had opened a curtain in her office that had been closed since she moved in, and on clear days the light came in at an angle that reminded her of the decommissioned lab and the stripped benches and the man who had put his hands flat on the surface and stated the facts without theater. She called her sister every evening now. She answered on the first ring still, from whatever room she was in, whatever meeting she was adjacent to. She had stopped calculating the cost of the calls she had missed. On a Saturday morning, Diana was at the pharmacy's corner table with her laptop and a cup of tea, while Mara did the molecule phase on a sheet of paper, and Joel worked at the bench on the other side of the counter. His hand rested on the counter near where Diana was sitting. Her hand was near it. Neither had moved. Neither was going to move. The morning was doing what mornings do when the weight has been set down, and what's left is the room and the light and the people in it. Some things are sold for $20 because the person selling them has been told they are worth $20, and the person doing the telling knows exactly what they are worth, and the distance between those two numbers is not a gap. It is a deliberate architecture. The only way to dismantle it is with the truth stated plainly, by the people who are willing to hold it until the moment comes. And sometimes the moment comes because a 7-year-old offers a stranger a vial of perfume and says, "Maybe that's why you came." If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who has ever been told that what they built was worth nothing. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Here's the question for the comments this week. If you had invented something that was taken from you for $20 and you watched it become worth $400 million, and the person standing in front of you didn't know they were holding the instrument of that theft, would you tell them? Or would you protect them from the knowledge, the way Joel did, and wait until the moment was right? Tell us what you would do. We read everyone.